Today's episode of the podcast is a New Zealand Winegrowers special and sees marketing GM Charlotte Reid and CEO Philip Gregan taking us on a deep dive into this most successful of industry bodies. We discover the origins of the New Zealand wine industry and hear how the Sale of Liquor Act 1959 helped lay its foundations. Before hearing about industry pioneers and the first stirrings of international recognition for New Zealand wine and its Sauvignon Blanc in the 80s and 90s, the pair then give us an overview of the current state of New Zealand wine growers and how they best serve their members, Philip giving an overview of responsibilities and Charlotte speaking to the marketing structure and specific digital initiatives she's overseen since the start of the pandemic, New Zealand having harvested at the height of the pandemic, the pair share some of the initiatives implemented by wineries to limit transmission. They discuss how the pandemic has affected consumption of New Zealand wine around the world. And we close out looking ahead for the industry and upcoming digital initiatives. Enjoy.
There's a lot of sort of debate about the origins and the development of the modern New Zealand wine industry, and one of the, I think for me, one of the key dates is the 1959 Sale of Liquor Act. It sounds a very long time ago, but it was critical because up until then in New Zealand, unless you were staying in a hotel, and you were eating in a hotel dining room, it was illegal to sell food and alcohol together. And this was the legacy of sort of neo-prohibitionism. And so we had these very tight rules in New Zealand, and we had all bars used to shut at 6 o'clock in the evening. You couldn't serve food and alcohol together. There were certain types of bars that women couldn't go into. And what the 1959 Sale of Liquor Act did was allow the development, the opening of licensed restaurants in New Zealand, so where people could prepare a meal, you'd come in and buy it, and you could sit down and buy a glass of wine or a bottle of wine at the same time. Now, of itself, that didn't mean a lot, but what it did is it meant the industry had to focus, or started to focus, on producing wines that were suitable for consumption of food, because up until then, the majority of the production had been fortified style wines, the port and sherry style stuff. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, you get a real revolution in wine styles in New Zealand. The development of table wines, effectively as we know them today. And you go through the 1970s, and you start to see an awakening around wine in New Zealand. There's a growth in international travel and tourism, and all of a sudden, all over New Zealand, from effectively Central Otago to Northland, you see people starting to put in vineyards. And whether it's the Seyfrieds and the Finns and Nelson, Alan Brady and others in Central Otago, in Marlborough, or in Wairarapa, you see that these pioneers starting to develop the New Zealand wine industry. You sort of move along 10 years into the mid-1980s, and the New Zealand economy had been very protected. And there was a financial crisis at that time, and there was a new government came in, a Labour government, and they opened up the New Zealand economy to competition from other markets. And that was very confronting for the New Zealand wine industry, because it had been protected by high tariffs and all those sorts of protection measures. And there was this sort of dawning realization that as winemakers, people were going to have to get much more competitive, produce really high quality products. And that was sort of the development in the mid 1980s. And that's when you saw the first sort of widespread planting of Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Merlot, Pinot Noir. And there was also a realisation that New Zealand just couldn't stay in its own domestic market. It had to be much more international in its outlook. And so in sort of the mid to late 80s, you see the industry and some of the pioneer exporters starting to get out into the market. The likes of David Honan from Cloudy Bay, Ernie Hunter from Hunter's Wines, Corbin's and Cook's Wines. Some of these names still live on. Some of them have basically disappeared. But you saw those first forays into export markets. And then really in the late 80s, in the late 80s, you saw some recognition starting to develop for Sauvignon Blanc, picked up by commentators like Oz Clarke, for example, but there were others as well. And that New Zealand started to develop some momentum around that time. But most of what the industry was exporting at that time effectively was they were still focused on the domestic market. And it was only really from about 1993, 94 onwards that you saw investment in vineyards and wineries dedicated to export markets. Somebody would plant a vineyard and say, my goal is I'm going to produce fruit off here, produce wine, and take that into the international, marketplace. And that slowly gained momentum in the industry. To give you a flavour, in about, I think, 1993, New Zealand exported about $20 million worth of wine a year. And at that time, as the flavour was, everybody was doing plans for the millennium, so that there was a plan done for the New Zealand wine industry. And it said we were going to grow wine exports to around $100 million. So that was about a 4 or 5-fold increase. And there was a lot of debate about whether that was realistic or not. And actually, the industry got well over $100 million by 2000. The first successes were largely in the UK. And then it started to go into Australia, and then particularly from the mid-2000s on, the United States started to play an increasing role. But the real foundations for the industry, the export foundations, were laid in the late 80s and the mid through to the mid to late 1990s. And that 10-year period was this realisation that New Zealand wine could compete. There was something special here, and that gave a huge confidence to the winemakers to get out there and tell their individual stories. Yeah, if you asked most people in the New Zealand wine industry, say in the mid 1980s, was Sauvignon Blanc going to be the future of the New Zealand wine industry? It's such a big part of the New Zealand wine industry. Very few people would have said, yes, Sauvignon Blanc's it. But I think what the industry did well is think we have to be competitive internationally. And then what they did was that they went out and actually listened to what the market said to them. And whether it's the Oz Clarks of this world or commentators in Australia, the industry responded to what they actually said, and that was pretty critical at the end of the day. And they went back and they thought, Joe's saying, I like the Sauvignon Blanc, I'll go and plant some in my vineyard, or I like the Pinot Noir, they like the Pinot Noir, I'll go and plant some. And so I think it's been quite a market-led response.
Which is often quite unusual in the wine industry, where governments legislate what wine regions plant, and they're not able to be as nimble to market demands. So it's very market-led.
There's an old expression about never believing your own back label, which I think is a nice one. Don't get comfortable just because you've been successful and you've got this wonderful, you've got the story. It's about you've got to respond to the future and to the market. Yesterday's news is today's fish and chip paper, as they said.
Having enjoyed the opportunity to hear about the history and origins of the industry, I was keen to move things over to discussing New Zealand wine growers themselves and how they're currently set up, both in terms of their function and mission, and also the tactical side of things. Where in the world are they choosing to place their people, and what are some of the initiatives that they're focusing on?
New Zealand Winegrowers is an industry organisation. It's a body that is representative of, for, by New Zealand's 1,400 to 1,500 grape growers and winemakers, and that's something that's critically important that we never forget who we are, because that's our, if you like, our USP. We're representing all the grape growers, all the winemakers in New Zealand. We are there to work on their behalf for them and to represent their interests. Mm-hmm. And I think to be successful as an industry organisation, whether it's in our industry or any industry, a lot of it comes down to having a good reputation, and people and members and the customers you're dealing with, in effect, trusting you. And trust is very important. For our members, they have got to trust that the information we give them is accurate and is relevant to them. And we're not just telling them something because it may be of vague interest, but because it's going to have potentially some impact on their business. They also have to trust us to hold the information they give us. We collect all sorts of confidential information from growers and wineries, and they need to know that trust is going to be respected, and that we'll only use that information for the benefit of the whole industry, and we won't disclose any details about them as individuals to any other outside parties. So I think that issue of trust is very important. As to the sort of day-to-day of what we do, we've got 4 broad areas of activity. We've got a strong research function. We operate that through a separate entity, the Brigato Research Institute, which has a facility in Marlborough, but which operates throughout New Zealand. And our grape growers, our wineries, have always placed a very high value on research. And if you go back into the mid-1980s in New Zealand, Dr. Richard Smart helped transform viticulture in New Zealand to produce really high-quality grapes and wine. It's been a very important part of what we do, and that continues to be the case. We deal a lot with the government, so that's our advocacy work, and that's with New Zealand, and obviously with international trade being a very big part of what we do. We have a strong international focus, but we also need to reflect the fact that 300 to 400 of our wineries only sell in the domestic market in New Zealand. So issues around wine tourism, cellar doors, and those sorts of things are important as well. We have a big thrust around sustainability, and we've got our environment team who do that. We run a sustainability program in New Zealand, sustainable wine growing, and we've done that since the mid-1990s. We just see sustainability as sort of one of the core values for New Zealand wine. We need to look after the places and the people that make our fantastic wine. So it's always been a big focus for us. And the last sort of arm of our activity is around marketing. And really that took off with the development of international markets for New Zealand wine. And we've always worked very, very closely with the exporting wineries and assisting them to be successful in the marketplace.
So as GM of Marketing at New Zealand Winegrowers, I've looked back at my own experience in marketing. I started out my career in brand management with big budgets, advertising, ads on television, the likes, moving into the wine world where you understand that marketing budgets are more limited just to the nature of the industry. Whilst I was at Villa Maria, was I guess a customer of New Zealand Winegrowers. They really did help our collective efforts as a country to eke our position on the worldwide stage. So I had a perception of what it's like to be a recipient of the support of New Zealand Winegrowers. So after having had my foray with the New Zealand Winery, plus the experience of my time with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, where they were also promoting wine exports, I brought those experiences into New Zealand Winegrowers, and I've really been trying to understand where is the white space that we operate, where is that area where our member wineries are not acting themselves, where is the government not acting themselves, and that is where you really add value, where you are in a space no one else is operating. So over the past year, we've been really simplifying how we talk about what we do. It's been divided into 3 key pillars, where our primary objective is to help strengthen and build the premium reputation for New Zealand wine, the New Zealand wine category build. The second pillar is forging and building strong connections. We have a network of international market managers in our major markets around the world, the UK being our first, US, Canada, China, and creating those connections with key influencers, trade, consumers is very, very important. And especially now in COVID times with borders closed, that's more important than ever before for our wineries who can't get to market. We keep that New Zealand wine story alive. And then the third pillar is focusing on building capability in our members to have more sustainable businesses, whether it be here in New Zealand if they're domestically focused or if they are overseas focused with their exports, providing up-to-date intelligence and insights, research data to help make better wine decisions. New Zealand Winegrowers is seen across the board as being an authoritative source for information on New Zealand wine, and here in marketing, the research that we provide is very, very important. So, to sum that all up in just a sentence, we help strengthen the premium reputation of New Zealand wine and ensure it remains frequently mentioned, bought and praised around the world. That's us in a nutshell. Providing those quality market insights. And then on the back of that, Philip mentioned that in recent years we've allocated more resource into the wine tourism space, as many of our wineries don't export, and that helps build capability of our members who operate in that tourism space to maximise their investments there, to build a stronger New Zealand wine brand. So those are the 3 areas we focus on, and the activity streams that activate that. Education is very important. When we say education, those are the seminars, masterclasses that we conduct in our major export markets to influencers, trade, the events we conduct to activate and market, the annual trade tasting in London every January, that's been on the calendar for the last 20 years and is firmly ensconced there. Our ongoing presence at key wine fairs such as Provine is very important for our members. And our visit program historically has been an incredible way for the New Zealand wine story to be shared, grabbing those valuable column inches and screen impressions. In COVID times, it's incredibly challenging to execute that. So what we're focusing on now is helping seed the interesting stories we have to share with journalists around the world through Media Hub, where we have a PR specialist here helping bring those relevant New Zealand wine stories to the world. And in recent times, with all of us moving into the digital world, we've been doing some really interesting stuff via webinar. We have conducted 15 webinars since the COVID crisis hit us here back in March, and we've been bringing a combination of key information to our members on how to do it better, how to adapt quickly in this market. We've had digital focus, digital transformation, digital gurus like Paul Mabray, Polly Hammond speaking. In the UK, we've had Richard Siddle of The Buyer beam into our members to give his perspectives of the impact of COVID in the UK market. A few weeks ago, we had Luli Halstead of Wine Intelligence take us through their waves of COVID impact research in 4 major markets around the world, including the UK, US, Australia and China. So our members have really been supported during this challenging time with what we hope is the right, most relevant information to navigate their businesses moving forward. Part of our efforts to drive preference for New Zealand wine and to drive frequency of mention of New Zealand wine, whether it be capturing the interest of journalists, wine media, trade, but increasingly consumers. We've got to have conversations taking place across multiple platforms. So the types of initiative such as the New Zealand Wine Diaries, that's very much directed at an informed trade audience. Whereas an activity that we did in the United States with the Wine Enthusiast magazine is appealing to their wine-savvy consumers as well as trade. And so we are thinking in terms of our audiences, different initiatives for slightly different audiences. Coinciding with Organic Wine Week coming up, we're going to be involved in an Instagram Live, which is a new platform we've not engaged with because our audience engage on that. So we're listening to where our audiences like to hang out. We need to, I guess, play in the appropriate sandpit depending on our audiences. And the education piece, we've got such a rapidly evolving industry story to tell. Innovation continues here every day in New Zealand. We're not afraid to try new things. We have the Lighter Wines initiative. That's incredibly exciting. I was at New Zealand House last November for a tasting of New Zealand wines led by Dr. John Forrest, and from my time in the UK, all the who's who of the wine journalists were in that room really leaning forward, interested in what New Zealand is doing in that space. And that's a space that's responding to trends in health and wellness, moderation occasions. We've got busy lives. The way that people engage with wine now is changing, and the lighter wine space that New Zealand is focusing on is addressing addressing those needs. So we will continue to tell our stories of what we're doing with our various grape varieties. The New Zealand wine story is so much more than Sauvignon Blanc, and you might see 95% of our sales to the United States being Sauvignon Blanc. But there's so much more to tell, and we need to focus on our diversity message, diversity of region, diversity of grape styles. We have over 26 grape varieties planted in New Zealand. Amazing stories of Albarino, Grüne Veltliner. There's even a Saint Laurent from Central Otago. And so it continues to offer the wine lover interesting reasons to continue to explore New Zealand wine. You don't get bored. There's always something new to try.
I then invited the pair to share a specific example which focused on the work done by New Zealand Winegrowers under its advocacy umbrella, in which they put forward the case that the wine industry be classified as an essential service, which was absolutely critical given the timing of the harvest right at the peak of the pandemic back in March 2020. As
we were approaching the 2020 vintage, obviously we had COVID-19 starting to erupt around the world. Our vintage normally starts very late February in northern regions and goes through basically to the end of May in our southern regions. And just to provide some context, we had the first case of COVID in New Zealand on something like February the 25th or 26th or something like that. And our country went into lockdown, which is a fairly hard form of lockdown on March the 25th. So it from a winemaking, grape growing perspective, it couldn't have come at a worse time. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we only produce grapes once a year, so you've got one chance if you're a grape grower to get those grapes off the vine and into the winery. And if you don't do it, you have no income for the next year. So we launched our emergency response from the New Zealand Winegrowers perspective. It happened to be on exactly the same day as the first COVID case was declared in New Zealand. We weren't aware that was happening, but our timing was pretty good. And we had, with our response, we had really two or three objectives. One was obviously to keep the industry operating. Second was to make sure that we gave the grape growers and the winemakers in New Zealand the best information that they could get about how they could operate. And thirdly, we wanted to be the point of contact for the government dealing with any issues in the wine industry. Lots of people have said to us, how was it that the wine industry continued to operate as an essential business? And a lot of it, if you think about the background, a lot of it was about what the wine industry's done over the last 20 or 25 years. It has shown that it's an industry that can be trusted, that it operates well, that it's got and that it's performing well for New Zealand. And if we put that on a base layer, if you like, then what we did is we made sure that we left no stones unturned in terms of getting our position made clear to the government. My chairman rang me at some stage in early March and said to me, there's some cabinet ministers going to be up in my region. Should I go and have a chat to them? And I said, given COVID-19, it's a must. It's a must attend meeting, and on the back of that meeting, we learned some stuff, which we then provided some further information to the government. I think the really compelling issue, though, ultimately was we are a biologically based industry, and the vines continue to grow, the fruit ripens, and unless you do complete those human tasks at the schedule which is dictated by nature rather than by man, if you don't do it on the schedule dictated by nature, you can massively fail in quality terms, most importantly, but also in quantity terms. And I think that the government in New Zealand, because we're such a big food producer, understood the imperative of biology of nature. And biology and nature are inflexible, which meant that the human reaction had to be flexible. And so we were able to operate, but there were some pretty strict protocols in place. Mm-hmm. And the industry is incredibly proud of Vintage 2020 because there's some fantastic wines. But one of the things we're most proud of is the fact there was not one case of COVID-19 spreading in a vineyard or a winery operation during our busiest time of the year. And that's something we're very proud of. We were privileged to operate, and the industry took that privilege to heart, and I think got some well-deserved plaudits from the government for the way it operated and the way it behaved.
Given the successes of the New Zealand wine industry in navigating a particularly difficult situation, and also being mindful that there are regions in the Northern Hemisphere that are currently harvesting, I asked the pair if there were any particular best practices or learnings that they would share with either their Northern Hemisphere cousins for Harvest 2020 or indeed for any other Southern Hemisphere regions that may still be affected by COVID through into 2021.
Look, it's COVID-19 is all about spread and restricting the spread, and one of the ways to do that obviously is to limit contact, and social distancing became important. But historically, the normal way that grapes would be delivered if they were coming in on a truck into a winery would be a piece of paper that would be handed over from the truck driver to at the weighbridge or to the winery with the detail of what the grapes were. And so the wineries said, well, we can't have pieces of paper being handed over because potentially it could carry COVID. So everything was done paperless as far as possible. Now, it seems like a small thing, but that was the sort of level of detail that people had to go to. As another example, lots of wineries got camper vans into their winery sites, and the vintage staff all stayed in camper vans for the length of the harvest. Now, that may have been 8 weeks, 9 weeks, or whatever. So the winemakers were operating in separate bubbles and to ensure there was no contact with outside parties or anything like that. Lots of wineries got in camper vans so that their vintage staff were living in camper vans on site at the winery. That meant that they were separated from their families for 6, 7, 8 or 9 weeks or whatever. But it just shows the level of detail that people went to practice social distancing, to stop the contact that could have led to any spread of the virus.
So I think it's a real vintage story of ultimate commitment. Every vintage is, but this year especially, but coupled with the fact that we had incredible weather throughout the ripening season, so the fruit is just of stellar quality. So not only did all the effort pay off, but I think when the world starts to enjoy the 2020s, it'll just have such a rich story around it. Incredible wines, but with an incredible story of how they were brought to market. And I've seen some of the stories. Many of our wineries, I'm sure, are going to be letting out a bit of footage of how it was for them, but really, really interesting times.
Given the timing of this conversation and that it coincided with a number of restaurants reopening in London, I was keen to explore the impacts that the previous 6 months had had on the flows of wine out of New Zealand, and indeed whether wineries had needed to adapt their business models in order to make up for a reduced demand overseas.
So we've been incredibly heartened by what we're seeing in the wine sales arena globally. With the uncertainty, it could have gone either way. You do see in recessions over history that alcohol is a category that's well supported, but you just don't know. COVID is something that's unprecedented. If you are a winery that has the privilege of having retail listings or an online presence, the COVID situation has been very favourable because people have flocked online to buy wine or gone to their local supermarket. For those wineries who are predominantly on-premise, on-trade oriented, yes, it's very challenging. So COVID, I think, is very much a story of there are some winners and there are some losers. So it's, as the industry body, we're aiming to provide insights and intel to help people make the changes they need to in their businesses to be more resilient, whether that be the move into the direct-to-consumer, optimising your cellar door operations. That's all been part of our efforts. But in the UK, US, export performance is looking very strong, and that is largely because of our major wineries selling into the UK off-trade and into the US retail sector.
Wineries have had to respond very dynamically to what's happening in the market. This is a completely unprecedented situation where segments of the market have just closed through no fault of anybody's, and wineries have had to respond really dynamically to those changes, and I think in general terms they have, because they've had to, and I think and there'll be that requirement, if you'd like, I'm sure is going to generate some very exciting developments and initiatives out the other side. When we reflect and look back, I think we'll, maybe in 18 months' time, we'll say, wow, that's an incredibly exciting development that has occurred. And I just think that's, every dark cloud has a silver lining. I think there are going to be a lot of silver linings here. There have to be.
Yeah. Well, we've learned as an organisation in how we provide value to members that it doesn't necessarily have to involve a plane trip anymore or a face-to-face meeting. In terms of the time that we ask of our members, we can deliver information now over webinar. It's been an incredible learning period for that. And in terms of the types of activities that we've been doing where we connect with trade, connect with sommeliers, connect with those that we're really feeling for now out there with the changed landscape. We've been doing some really innovative stuff and it's been exciting. The New Zealand Wine Diaries, Mastering the Conversation, the initiative we've been running across 4 countries with 4 Masters of Wine or Masters Sommeliers where we've had 4 editions. The last edition is coming up very soon, actually, on the 24th of September, coinciding with our New Zealand Organic Wine Week. And that has been really, really fabulous way of having key influencers in our major export markets talk about really topical points. First one focusing on Sauvignon Blanc during Sauvignon Blanc Day. The next one focusing on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which have fabulous story to tell from New Zealand. Our third one was looking more beyond COVID. What are the trends? And then this last one, dispelling the myths about organic wine. We're really looking forward to Stephen Wong, our Master of Wine here in New Zealand, who's passionate in that space, having a conversation with David Keck, Master Sommelier, John Zavo from Canada, as well as Ronan Sayburn, Master Sommelier in the UK. And really fabulous format that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of had COVID not happened, and that's going to become our new normal. We will have a combination of face-to-face. We hope once that we're all beyond this, but that virtual pivot will be with us to stay.
Given the location of New Zealand and its relative distance from its main export markets, I was keen to explore the idea that the industry's acceptance of technology had actually been accelerated by COVID-19 and its relative restrictions, and that while there'll never be any replacement for getting out and standing in the vineyard, that the other advantages of using technology, including reduced time, money, and carbon footprint, meant that 2020 heralded a new dawn, and that the industry may never go back exactly to how it was pre-COVID-19.
I mean, who would have thought that with the Liquor Board of Ontario, we would have had speed dating sessions online to have access to those buyers. It's a incredibly sought-after appointment to have, and we would manage to arrange a speed dating series of opportunities for our wineries to connect in with those buyers. And what I've also found is that we're all in the same boat. So conversations seem to be happening a lot more. We collaborated with the Oregon Wine Board in the UK with Ronan Sayburn, 67 Pall Mall, to have a Pinot Noir tasting back in June. Incredibly successful event. So we're looking for all ways to collaborate to arguably create a stronger platform for New Zealand wine.
It's the last sort of big question, and it's in sort of typical interpreting wine style. It is a future-oriented question, and I think the way I would like to ask it is really, you've obviously had a lot of success, and you've had plans in place, and you've had strategic plans in place. Given what's happened this year, and given the monumental changes that it's put on everybody, and obviously on an industry there, how, as a body, how far do you give yourself, I guess, the luxury of looking ahead now? Given that I would understand there is a certain tension. You are a leader for your industry, but with so much uncertainty out there, how far do you allow yourselves to plan ahead and I guess continue to lead the industry and anticipate their needs?
I think your point about a lot of uncertainty post-COVID is a really valid one. But I think if you go deeper, that provides you with a lot more certainty. So before I go deeper, if I can just go higher for a second, in September last year, we celebrated the 200th anniversary of the planting of the first grapevines in New Zealand. And obviously that was an important day to celebrate, but it gets you thinking about, okay, well, what's the next 200 years going to look like? And if nothing else, that in 200 years, when people look back to now, they won't think the industry's mature, developed, or anything like that. They'll still think it's in the pioneering phase, and hopefully their reflection is, what an incredibly exciting time the New Zealand wine industry had during the 21st century, and what a great foundation it established for the future. So I think timeframe's really, really important. I think also, despite the uncertainty, there are some things which are happening, and we need to understand. Climate change is one of those. It is going to impact. We might know all the details, and there may be some argument about whether it's 1.5 degrees or 2.5 degrees. The fact is, the world's changing, climate's changing. We need to think about that. We mightn't have all the answers, but we need to be open-minded and thinking about that into the future. We know, for example, that the available land area in Marlborough is limited. What does that mean for the industry going forward? Where are the new and exciting areas that the industry should be looking at within the context of climate change? So I really think thinking forward, understanding where we're at, and just having a really positive view of the future, and not seeing problems but seeing opportunities and excitement is an incredibly positive way to think about the next period of time. In our industry, having a view of the future, the glass is half full, not half empty, I think is a good way of approaching the future.
Yes, I mean, the only other point I'd probably add to that is, the numbers that we're seeing in all these COVID webinars that we've been running is that it's looking incredibly bright for New Zealand. We had Wine Searcher deliver a webinar, and Wine Searcher is actually a New Zealand-based company. Not many people know that. I don't think I even knew that when I was using their service whilst I was based in the UK. But they've seen, search is a early predictor of commercial activity, buyer behaviour, and they've seen a lift in search for wine in the first 6 months of the year by 14%, I think. Lots of people at home dreaming about what they might want to drink, perhaps. But we've seen a lift of 22% for New Zealand wine. And Luli Halstead was touching on wine now starting to take that aperitivo opportunity. We are stealing share from beers and spirits for a non-food occasion. So there's some incredibly positive things coming for the wine industry, and New Zealand will leverage off that. Yeah, one thing I haven't mentioned is, part of what we lead is a major event strategy where every 2 years we bring the who's who of the wine world down to New Zealand to celebrate every 2 years, either Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Noir. And our Pinot Noir conference was due to be held in February 2021. Due to COVID, it has unfortunately been delayed by a year to February 2022. We're really looking forward to having the focus on New Zealand's Pinot Noir at that point in time. And we'll continue the conversation in the year leading up to that. But it'll be really interesting to see where is the wine world going to be in February 2022. We have no idea how long it's going to take the world to navigate our way out of these current challenges we face. And it may be that the virtual learnings that we're taking on board about how to deliver our wine message to the world, it may be a hybrid. We'll see what it looks like. And I think that there's just a point to make that New Zealand has been lauded around the world in the time of COVID for how we have responded to the crisis and how we've all banded together collaboratively to get it under control. And our Prime Minister overseas has been seen very favourably. And so the government is now launching an initiative to, whilst borders are closed, to drive preference for New Zealand. You can't come here to visit, but whilst you can't, we'd like to just continue to keep New Zealand wine top of mind. And so there are going to be efforts in the food and beverage space to tell the stories of our fabulous food and beverage, of which wine is a part. So New Zealand Winegrowers is working closely with the government to make sure that our great New Zealand wine story is told, and we will be beaming that around the world over the next 6 months to a year.
Thank you so much, Charlotte and Philip, for your time in sharing this story of New Zealand wine growers. A fascinating story at any time. I think it's particularly insightful to hear how the New Zealand wine industry has coped so well with the challenges of COVID-19. And in line with our discussion, I would like to extend an invitation from the New Zealand Wine Growers to sign up for the last of the New Zealand Wine Diaries, entitled Organic Wine, Dispel the Myths and Embrace the Future, which takes place this Wednesday, the 23rd of September, between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. UK time. Please do see the first link in the description below to sign up directly. And if you would like to explore any of the themes discussed in today's episode in greater depth, I've left below a link to the New Zealand Wine Annual Report. And if you're not already, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.